The Indian diaspora in South Africa is under attack. They fear that the riots are taking a racial turn. Their businesses are being targeted.
The South African riots have now posed a threat to over 1 million strong Indian diaspora in the country.
So who are South African Indians, and why can't we just go back to where we came from? Well, I'm South African Indian, and not only was I born in South Africa, but my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents were all born here in South Africa. So going back to where I came from would essentially mean remaining right here. Oh, you're confused. Well, let's discuss. Our story begins in 1652, when Jan van Riebeeck established a Dutch settlement in the Cape of Good Hope on request of the Dutch East India Company. Van Riebeeck's duties were to build a fort, improve the natural anchorage at Table Bay, plant cereals, fruit and vegetables, and obtain livestock from the indigenous Khoi people. As part of the settlement in the Cape, a way station was established to supply provisions to Dutch East India fleets sailing between the Dutch Republic and Batavia, known today as Indonesia. In 1653, a woman named Mary was bought for Van Riebeeck as a slave from Batavia. Mary's place of birth was Bengal. A few years later, Van Riebeeck bought an entire family, Domingo, Angela, and their 3 children, from Batavia, also to use as slaves. Between 1619 and 1725, many people from India, mainly Bengal, Coromandel Coast, and Kerala, were brought to the Cape and sold into slavery. As slavery was prohibited in Holland, officers of the Dutch East India Company took slaves with them and sold them in the Cape when returning to Holland from Asia. There were also slaves brought on Danish and British ships. The Indian slaves came from Dutch trading posts in India, as well as from Batavia, where thousands of Indians had been enslaved. Many of these slaves who were sold in the Cape were not slaves back in India, but rather were domestic servants. Reverend William Wright wrote, "Some who are natives of Bengal and other parts of India came to the colony as free servants and were bartered or given away to the colonists. There were also children who were kidnapped in India and then sold as slaves." Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India at the time, wrote, "The practice of stealing children from their parents and selling them as slaves has long prevailed in this country and has greatly increased since the establishment of the English government in India. Numbers of children are conveyed out of the country on the Dutch and French vessels." An Indian slave who was brought to the Cape in this manner was Ari. Ari was kidnapped as a child while playing with the other children on the Surat beach. He was sold from one master to another and was treated so harshly that he ran away. He joined other fugitive slaves and lived on stolen food until he was caught and imprisoned. Ari was not tortured or prosecuted due to the intercession of a Dutchman, Jacob van der Heyden, who was confined with Ari in the same dungeon in Cape Town. There are stories of slaves in the Cape who were granted freedom. One story is the marriage of Jan Vutus, a white man, and Catherine of Bengal, a woman who was liberated from slavery. However, many of the slaves were treated cruelly and lived in miserable conditions. In the 1700s, Alexander from Bengal ran away from his owners and was captured. He was flogged, branded, pilloried under the gallows, and sentenced to 12 years of hard labor in chains. He escaped again and was again captured. He was then broken on the wheel after 8 pieces of flesh were pulled out from him with hot tongs. The slaves led a number of rebellions, the largest of which occurred on the 27th of October, 1808, where hundreds of slaves, including those of Indian origin, marched from Swartland to Cape Town to demand freedom. The government ended up only charging the leaders of the resistance in order to avoid further repercussions. During their time in the Cape, the slaves of Indian origin integrated into the Cape White and Cape Coloured communities. In fact, intimate relations between white men and slaves of Asian origin were not uncommon. Many of the children of Asian slaves had white fathers. In fact, many white settlers married and had children with Asian slaves, and their children were accepted into the white community. The mother of Simon van der Stel, after whom Stellenbosch is named, was the daughter of a Dutch captain from Batavia and an Asian slave. J.A. Hees, a historian and a pioneer in the field of family research, estimated that 7.2 to 10.7% of the ancestors of the Afrikaner population in 1807 were of African or Asian descent. As part of the community, Indians also contributed to the Afrikaans language, which was originally created by slaves and colored people. The oldest known Afrikaans text was published in 1856 and was a Muslim religious text. An interesting fact about that book is that it was actually written in Arabic script. However, the language in the text is still Afrikaans. By the early 18th century, the number of slaves in the Cape exceeded the number of white settlers, and the slaves were the ones who did the hard work of developing the land. Thus, the role of Indian slaves in the development of South Africa cannot be ignored. The slave trade in the Cape continued until 1834, when slavery was abolished. However, that is not the last record of Indians coming to South Africa. Our story now moves to 1860, when the first Indians were brought to South Africa as indentured laborers. In 1851, sugar from sugarcane was first produced in Natal, giving the British colony in Natal much hope for economic development. However, there was one setback, which was that labor was difficult to find. The local people refused to work in the fields due to the low pay and unpleasant working conditions. This led the colony to try to obtain labor from abroad. When Sir George Grey, the governor of the colony in Cape Town, arrived in Natal in 1855, he pushed for the supply of labor from India. He had seen the results of Indian labor on the sugarcane fields in Mauritius and felt that bringing Indians to South Africa would help them thrive economically. He requested that an inquiry be sent to the government of India in this regard. The First Indian War of Independence delayed the decision of the government of India. Eventually, after much correspondence, the Natal Act was passed to allow for the introduction of Indian labor to Natal. The act consisted of 3 laws. Law 13, which stated that only licensed persons could bring immigrants into the colony, Law 14, and Law 15, which related to the official requisition of the employer to the Indian agent to engage Indian labor. Law 14 detailed the conditions under which laborers would be brought to Natal, including working hours, passage from India, and fines and penalties applicable to the indentured laborers. The law also stated that the period of indenture would be for 5 years, after which the laborers would be allowed to either return to India or remain in South Africa as immigrants. Post the passing of this law, on the 16th of November in 1860, the first Indians arrived in Natal. The first batch of 342 Indians came from Madras, which is now Chennai, aboard the Truro. The second batch of Indians arrived a little later on the 26th of November of the same year from Calcutta, now known as Kolkata, aboard a ship named the Belvedere. The Indians were not labourers in their home country, but a mix of blacksmiths, mechanics, gardeners, domestic workers, and weavers who were now being asked to work as labourers in the sugarcane fields of Natal. The majority of Indians in this first batch could not read, and those who could not read English, and of course, their contracts were written in English. Translators were not provided in order to help them understand what the contract said. Their method for signing their contracts was to use their thumbprint. Mansinger Andhas, in his book The Incredible Journey from India, describes this as a well-organized department by their new oppressors, not only to deny them their basic human rights, but also to keep them totally in the dark about their new rule. In fact, it's not difficult to conclude, as many historians have, that the labourers from India were unaware that the simple thumbprint signified them signing away their freedom and sentenced them to years of indentured labour in cruel, inhumane conditions. This was the first in a series of videos that I will be doing about the history of Indians in South Africa. The next video will focus on the indentured labourers in Natal, their journey to South Africa, and the conditions in which they lived when they were here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.